Hi, I'm David. I'm a graduate transport modeller at WSP in Bristol, and I'm presenting on my research project that I've been doing into speed flow curves in strategic models. So the project was commissioned by National Highways, and its aims are to confirm that the most appropriate curve forms are being used in our models, potentially to update guidance on which speed flow curves are recommended for use. And if we can have enough data to re-estimate some existing curves, and we'll be focusing on 3 and 4 lane curves used in 3 and 4 lane motorways. So we'll begin with what is a speed flow curve, and it's a function that defines the relationship between traffic flow and its speed. They're also known as volume delay curves, which is dependent on whether your model is determining speeds or journey times. So we'll be looking at two types of curves, which are the theory curves, so the recommended curve usage. So in this case, we'll be looking at the tag curve, and the software curves, which are what the modeling packages we use have available to them, and that will be the Saturn curve and the Vism BPR curve. So why do these need to be re-estimated? The tag curves were originally estimated in the 1970s using data that was available. We've now obviously got a lot more data available, and we also have much more a higher resolution of data. So this is investigations using data that's available, that's taken every minute at sites, and they're important to re-estimate because the speed, to be able to accurately estimate this relationship between speed and flow underpins benefit estimates that we use in tuber calculations that feed into benefit cost ratios, and it's also used in air quality and greenhouse gas appraisals. So it's quite important for several different areas and reasons. So some quick concepts that are used in most speed flow curves. We have a flow, a capacity of your road, a break point, which is a point in certain curves where the relationship between the flow and the speed changes, often adjusting the equation you use or gradients and things, and a free flow speed or an initial speed, depending on the curve, and a breakpoint speed, and the breakpoint speed is your speed at the breakpoint. So we'll begin by looking at the tag curve. So they are also known as the Koba curves, which is what they were originally used for. They're linear piecewise curve. They are mainly drawn based on road geometry. So if we look at the M1, the gradient of the curve, that's largely influenced by road geometry, percentage of HGVs, which also affect the initial speed, the V0 factor. And we have two curves, one for pre-breakpoint flow and one for breakpoint flows after. So this is what the curve looks like when plotted it's not based on, this is just some arbitrary values put in. And we can see that we've got an initial curve, and then at the breakpoint, we get a different curve with a steeper gradient. And if we look at the Saturn curves, these take a completely different form. So they needed to be continuous polynomial functions, and they take the form in time. So these are a volume delay function, but can be written as a speed flow curve, which is shown here. And these use the parameter n to try and fit them to the tag curves to be similar. So if we look at the curve here, we can see the initial curve up to capacity, and then after capacity, we actually use a different equation, which is a tag equation that's given, but in Saturn, you generally don't want to be getting flows above capacity. So you are trying to keep it within this curve. So this is the part that will be focused on in the analysis. Vism again uses a continuous polynomial function, but it's based on the US Bureau of Public Roads curves. And actually, instead of using flow, it's based on the saturation, which is a measure of the flow compared to the capacity of the road. And again, it's a volume delay curve that's had to be converted into a speed flow curve relationship in order to compare with tag. So looking at this one, we can see it's one continuous curve. There are variations of the BPR which do have a below capacity and above capacity curves, more similar to tag. But in this instance, we're currently just going to focus on the single continuous curve. So the methodology we used for the analysis was we extracted data for a month period, in this instance March, for a site for all lanes. We've then filtered the data down to only consider between the time periods of 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. This is because we think the behaviours outside those hours is likely to have too little flow, so we won't get the higher flows, and also at night likely driving behaviours will be slightly different, likely people travelling at slower, which might skew the data somewhat, particularly as modelling is mainly focused in the AM, PM and inter-peak periods. We then removed undesired values, so currently we've set that as to any speed below 60 kilometres an hour and any flow above 255. The 60 is based on we don't want to get queues where traffic is stationary from accidents and things, because that's not what a speed flow curve is trying to estimate. It's about the relationship between flow and speed, not just the general, not including incidents where traffic is stationary. And the 255 is based on the data we got from national highways. The 255 is used as an error criteria, so that flags an error with the reading. So we've used that to remove those values from the data. We then calculated weekly averages, and then from that monthly averages. So this is an example site 1, which we plotted all the weekly flow averages against one another, and also the monthly average. And you can see that the data is quite similar across the weeks. And this was initially done to sort of see if you would need month data to accurately model flow, or whether week data would actually be sufficient to estimate a speed flow curve for a site. And then once we did that, we calculated the monthly standard deviation for each flow, which resulted in this plot. And we can see from this that there's quite a high standard deviation for low flows, and then for higher flows we actually get narrower standard deviations. One of the reasons for this is there's fewer flow counts at lower speeds, and with quite a high variety, which isn't too surprising given at lower flows people are perhaps more comfortable to drive slower than they would when traffic is a bit busier. And at higher flows, the very highest flows, we can also see that there is no standard deviation because there's only a single count. So in that case, you can't get a standard deviation from the average if it's the only point. And then from that, we plotted and fitted the curves from tag, VISM and Saturn against the data, and currently we tried to fit them through the data. So we can see from this curve that we plotted a tag min and max curve, so the minimum and the maximum possible values that a tag curve would give, and then a fitted Saturn and VISM curve. So if we look in at the data range, so we can see that the tag curve, the form doesn't really match the data. So if we look at this data, there isn't really an obvious breakpoint for this secondary gradient. And the initial gradient, again, doesn't really fit the data because we've got more of a polynomial curve, which we can see from how well the Saturn and VISM curves fit, with the VISM curve perhaps fitting slightly better than the tag curve, than the Saturn curve, And we can also see that the Saturn curve after capacity does not match the data at all. So this is a second site on the same road as the first one, just in a slightly different position. And we can see broadly that it's a similar situation. So the tag curves again aren't really fitting, and the polynomials are a much better fit. But we can also see we get a slightly different relationship at lower flows. We've got a gradual increase. And one of the next stages of the investigation would be to look, is this a site-specific thing, or perhaps something that's more common across other sites and something that needs to be reflected in a speed flow curve? So if we look at them side by side, we can see that these are similar datas, and that you can define a speed flow curve that will fit through the data points mostly. So the next steps of this investigation are to see if the relationship holds on additional sites and in other times of the year. So focusing on non-abnormal times. So we probably won't look at winter times where it becomes dark earlier, and in the summer where you've got tourist traffic as well. We'll probably be focusing in March, April, May time. We could look at, and probably will look at, some of the other curves available, particularly in Vism, which has multiple options for curves. So there's variations of the BPR and some other curves which we could look at plotting to see if they fit the data well as well. And then potentially to look at defining some new parameters and redefining curves with it for software. So looking at, can we define a 3-lane motorway curve, or is the outcome going to be that each site needs to have a specific curve fitted to the available data? And to do this, we'd probably need to look at how minute by minute data compares with the 15-minute publicly available data that we often use. So seeing, would a fitted curve actually go through that 15-minute data, or is it the minute by minute that allows the accurate plotting of a speed flow curve? Thanks for listening. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, David. Certainly a topic which appears to be evolving with what you're looking at in there. Certainly I'll kick off one question from me. So I'm looking at some of that data, particularly being a transport modeler myself. At the low flows, is there sort of some conclusions or statistical significance that need to be drawn out, or whether that data is excluded in terms of speed flow curves given large standard deviations?
Yeah, I think that's something that is next for us to look at, is do we need to set a criteria for, if we have only 5 observations of a flow at a particular speed, should we ignore that? And so I think we will look at distributions of counts to see if there is a way we can make that analysis a bit more robust than currently just plotting for all, because as you can see with the second curve, is you do get some high standard deviations, and that could just be because you have 2 counts at either end. So yeah, that's definitely where we'll probably be looking at refining the analysis further to see if we can get some more consistent results.
Thank you. Lauren, Neil, Sarah, if there's any questions from yourselves.
I'll ask one because I've just joined. Sorry, I'm late. I've been in training all week. So I've got a question about, like you said, that you excluded some certain months for the data. Just wondering, because like traffic patterns have changed a little bit now due to like changed working behaviours, more working from home for some people anyway. Just wondered if you'd considered that in the scope of the study at any point.
I mean, it would only really affect the timelines we would look at in terms of data. So we could actually plot all data, but we're currently just trying to see, it shouldn't really impact the speed flow curve relationship if we're extracting between daylight hours, because of the individual times aren't actually relevant. It's just how many observations we're getting per minute. So if anything, perhaps the more varied nature would reduce the number of higher flows we would see as people's commuting hours spread. So I think it's more going to impact the results from modeling rather than actual speed flow curve relationships. We just might get lower counts now than we perhaps would have if this had been done, say, 5 years ago.
Oh, Neil, I think you're on mute.
Again, another donation. Apologies, David, that was a very clear presentation. I always think it's very healthy and good to see when we challenge some of the fundamentals that we use in our professional work over many years. I was just curious as to what actually prompted this study, and was it anything to do with the concerns at the later stage of appraisal?
I think the main reason to do this is now that National Highways have that minute-by-minute data aggregation. So I think that's a relatively new piece of data for them, and now they've got enough. They wanted to see if there's now sufficient evidence to plot the curves, refit them. Now you can get now you've got 15 times more information than was previously available, which may not have picked up those small adjustments in speed you get from adjustments in traffic flow.
That's great. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I was just going to say, David, it's really interesting and great to hear about, like Neil said, challenging the assumptions. Is your estimation or prediction that you're going to have a significant impact in perhaps changing some of this underlying guidance or underlying curves that underpins modelling?
I think there's probably definitely going to be evidence to suggest that the parameters used in the current softwares need to be redefined. And I think looking at this, you would probably say that the tag curves need to be updated and perhaps be brought in line with the software packages, given it's unlikely that they'll be able to change to fit this data, whereas it's probably easier to redefine the theory curves to look at this data. And then I think the most interesting is going to be, are these curves for roads, so all three-lane motorways behave very similar, or is this a site-by-site analysis, so something you have to do for each site to try and to get the best results? And I think so we've done it for a couple of other sites so far, and looking at them, there is some variety. The shapes are broadly similar, but you do get small variations. So I think currently it does look like you would probably be looking at a site-by-site curve rather than a default three-lane curve and a 4-lane curve.
Cool. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, certainly be interesting to see where this goes in the future. So thank you very much.